getting stuff back and bringing it back to where it came from. And then Venkat, and thinking a little bit about the creation of archives that a lot of the folks associated with Milli get to do. Um, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the kind, and this is a really challenging thing when we think about the intergovernmental and international collaborations. How do we think about cultural property, whether that is local or international? How do we think about those kinds in terms of ethics? What are the kind of, I think maybe for many people in the Zoom room, it may be interesting to think about the kind of questions that we ask ourselves and the compromises we make with ourselves to preserve material. I'll throw that out as a question since you told me I had to go first. So I'm just going to throw it out as a question without answering.
I could answer your first question about repatriation. That was an initial goal and it has stayed with us. We keep working at it, but it's kind of a background theme. I don't think it's really what is our really main goal anymore in the way we work. We also look at creating archives either in a passive or an active manner. So that's kind of changed. We've also slowly opened up from recordings to documents and things that accompany material has changed a lot. You get a lot more born digital material. So all those kind of challenges have been new for us in terms of um, and repatriation is an interesting thing because earlier we always talked about moving things physically. Now that collections are digital, it actually shouldn't matter, but it still continues to matter to us as well as the donor archives. You know, the people are more actively seeking out local partnerships to, and are very excited about having them move, though, you know, on the other hand, it's just like, well, if it was digitally available, does it matter that there's a copy in an archive in India? But that's kind of interesting aspect of international collaboration that you talked about, and how we've dealt with also making sure that each of us respects the rights of the original material. I think that's one question that um, answers a bit of your question. Venkat.
Mary, if I understood your comment or question, I think just to clarify, you were asking broadly about how we think about preservation once we have, the ethics of preservation, whether if we as individuals or as archivists. I'm not sure if I fully understood the context in which you were framing this. Sorry, if you don't mind me asking you to repeat that part.
No, I'm not sure that it was a fully coherent kind of question. But I just a lot of I think there are a lot of challenges that are presented to us as people who hold on to documents and try to make them accessible. And I think there are lots of questions that we have, both in terms of what gets preserved and what doesn't get preserved, but then also how do we support these real needs and feelings that people have around materials uh, in responsible ways. Anything you want to say on that, I think would probably be provocative. And I think about it a lot when I think about community archiving, because people have a lot of enthusiasm and energy for community archiving, which is fabulous. But there's not a lot of awareness or I don't know. It's hard to find the sustainability in community archiving. And that falls to places that have physical, institutional, or deep connections with other kinds of things. So anything you want to say is great, Venkat.
Thank you. There are a couple of projects that I've been involved with recently. Maybe I'll just sort of use them as a crutch, if I may. There was a project on developing an oral history. It was an oral history project, Oral Histories of Climate Change, which was in collaboration with the Newcastle Oral History Collective, the archives at NCBS, which is the other hat I wear, and the the Srishti Institute in Bangalore, which where Indra Chaudhuri, who many of you of course know, was steering this conversation and this process. And this was a small attempt to try and think about intergenerational transfer of memory and preservation and access to that memory. So it was a small attempt in saying the project is partly about interviewing and documenting, but most of the project was an experiment in trying to build capacity. So the preservation aspect of it, the understanding, of course, was that most of this knowledge is transferred orally, and even if one were not to record it, it was going to still going to be transmitted orally to various members of the community. But our question was, how do you constantly build capacity through this as an experiment to allow people, to just sensitize around the idea that there are ways in which if you wish to preserve it as a record, and that's where I want to make the distinction that the transmission of knowledge orally, and this might be a provocation, to me is not the archive. There is, the commitment to record and not to bring technology into it, but you figure out your mode of recording. So the word record, committing to heart, as it were, is essential. And so I just wanted to separate these two, because there is often this idea that that the body is the archive or the mind is the archive. And so I just wanted to sort of take a step back from that and say that, yeah, let's figure out how to record. And so there were two components to this project. And so when I work with communities, this is one thing. The other is, of course, we're extremely hesitant in bringing the proverbial sort of wave file or something from there, situating it in an archive 2,000 kilometers away, and then it's largely accessible only to people another 4,000 kilometers away. So this is something that we have. I don't have a good answer to this question of whose knowledge and who's getting to see that knowledge and who's interpreting that knowledge. I do not have a good answer to this question. We've tried a small attempt, again, wearing my NCBS hat. We have material that was created 100 years ago, and we've identified the particular community that is represented in these papers. And we've been working directly with members of the community to come and engage with the archive to try and see how they might respond or want to redact or rethink how the material is represented of effectively their ancestors, to see what one could do. And it's lovely. One of the most important things they said, I don't know if this is relevant to the conversation, they said, because we offered the idea that they could just take the material back or take it out of the archive. But there was a problem here because it's not technically their material, it's their history, it's their it's a version of their memory, but the physical record is the record of this Canadian entomologist whose papers we hold, whether we like to admit this or not. But the second part, they say it doesn't make sense for us to remove material from the archive, because it's not like every archive around the world is a place where we can go and access and systematically start taking these ideas out. So there is strong archival value that they see in it, in many of these stories. But who gets to preserve it is something that I think we found working with community members was something they're very interested in. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer to, or not an answer, maybe a comment to your question. But I did have another question just as a follow-up, if I may. Mary, I want to just, come back. The people that you were, the images that you showed were so evocative. It's just sort of my daily life right now. And sort of when I see these, I sort of see us doing the same. But I'm curious, this may be a question for both Mary and Shubha, because you worked in different media. How have you dealt with the question of trust in many of these processes of where you're working with individuals who have almiras at home that they have kept for 70, 80, 100 years in some form. So could we talk a little bit about this trust relation that you end up developing? Because there is a certain aspect of performance in you as the potential archivist. And so you, I mean us as potential archivists. Sorry.
Venkat, if I'd like to address that, and also about community archives that both of you spoke about. I think this is really important, this thing of trust that you mentioned. And I really worry about how this can be institutionalized. I do feel that one of the success of ARC has been it's considered a trusted repository by many people. Now, how much of this trust is very often individual because the person is dealing with me or with you or with whoever, and there is that sense of personal comfort very often. I've had collectors telling me, I trust you to do right by this. I would like this to be preserved. It's my mother's. I don't really know how to do it, and I wouldn't like it to go to XYZ place. We do come across things like that because with music, it can be very tricky. It can be used in different ways. And that's really hard. I mean, we try to separate the individual from that, but there is a whole thing of trust. And how do we institutionalize? How do we move that from generation to generation, like the knowledge that, this trust gets institutionalized and what it means and how clear we can be about it. And that is kind of overlapping with the community factor. We can very proudly say we've done a few community-based projects, but they are hit by the same aspect, Mary, that you talked about sustainability. Each of these is a project, whereas actually it's people's lives. We go in with funding for 3 years and we say we want to empower, we want to do capacity building. We can train a few people to record, hopefully open their eyes to what it means to record and document their own culture and do all this. But we've really failed in our attempts to encourage people to, say, build their own repositories in any way, so that they're more local access. As we will keep copies so that, they're safer. But Venkat, it's similar. A lot of people have said it's better where it is. And we know it's safe and we know we can come there. But at the same time, there have been musicians who've said, maybe the next director won't know us. So so we're increasingly encouraging people to say to collectors, trying to put that in the agreements that the community will always be able to access. It should not just be the person who signed it, because somebody may say, who are you tomorrow when we walk in? We may not be as comfortable getting in here. So with communities, it's trickier because they're less used to it. And many musicians, because it's a different situation than dealing only with scholars. And scholars would like everything to be accessible and get copies of everything because it's easier to work. And there's an assumption today, and there's I really I feel very strongly about the way entitlement that is growing in the next generation of users, that unless it's on the internet, unless it's immediately available from my bedroom, it doesn't exist. I had somebody who came into the archive the other day who, sorry to give an example like this, to say, who wanted to work on Manganyar's mistake, coming to ARC and saying that, as some of you who know our work, and said, I wanted to work on them because actually nothing is known about this community. There's no information about them. So on the internet. So I think even on the internet, there must be more. So, this kind of thing. So I want to work on this. I said, well, go spend half a day in the library, you may change your mind. But, so this kind of entitlement, this expectation that unless it's on the internet, it isn't there. And yes, the digital dissolve is happening because also people in villages are using the internet from their phones. And so it is not as inaccessible as it was. And now people say, can you put some of our stuff on YouTube so that people can see it? So, all these reservations are also changing with people, or in both directions.
And I'll just jump in a little bit. I think you hit one of the core, I don't know, themes, challenges, opportunities we have as information kind of professionals, is to think about this question of trust. And so there's both the individual trust, as Shubha was sort of saying, and then there's this institutional trust. And part of that is also tightly related to control, and how much control we as institutions or collectors and holders of information both want. And when we start to think about questions of access, a lot of the control has to shift both from the original collection holder and from the institution if we're going to meet in the middle. So a lot of times with institutions, and so a lot of my research when I was doing this past couple of years, I was naive and I don't know, had a lot of hubris, which is like, oh, people are going to want to talk to me about all this stuff that they talk to me about in general, of this piles and piles of material that they have in their home that is a tremendous emotional and physical burden on them. And that was not necessarily the case. And I thought, well, institutions will want to talk to me about the kind of things that they hold as well. And that was also not the case. And so there's a big question around trust, and that has to be built up, as we all know, as researchers and scholars, through time, through repetition, through expansion of our communities, not just around the particular items that we're talking about, but like, do other scholars, do other people, do other things have trust in us as people who help get to facilitate archival preservation? But there's also a question of misfounded trust. So a lot of times I think people will say, oh, you have to take this because I can't manage it, or I trust you to take this. And I think as institutions, we have to be really transparent and sort of say, do you understand what that means? And also be honest with ourselves to say, I desperately want to help, but I cannot. That trust is misfounded. Either I don't have the money, I don't have the institutional resources, I don't have the proper access mechanisms, or I know that once I leave, nobody else will take this seriously, all those sorts of things. I think we have to be honest with ourselves. So the trust is a really thorny but mission critical question. Nice question, Venkat.
I'm going to just pop in here because we have a question in the chat that I think is really nice. And I'm wondering, Saida, would you like to ask your question in person, or do you want me to ask for you?
Hi, I don't have my camera, which means my laptop's camera died. Yes, I can ask the question if that's all right without a camera. So the question I have is, I come from Northeast India, and it's a really rich region when it comes to like informal archiving. And every now and then within the villages, I encounter sometimes mostly men and upper caste, middle class, like people who actually have had the access, like generational access to some sort of knowledge production. They hold these really unique and fascinating collections, and they welcome people. So I'm welcome to interact with them. But when it comes to sort of taking a photocopy, or recording them, or just taking it outside of the four walls and to use it for my research, then it becomes a bit contentious. And I also almost always struggle to make sense of, or to make sort of have a negotiation with them. I think it's a question of trust that we have been discussing quite a bit. But also, how do we make sure that some of this is preserved beyond my generation? I'm quite young, but still not that young, and thinking about future of this kind of archives and knowledge, more or less. So that's the question that I had in my mind. Sorry, with the camera, I think it's a bit hard to understand.
Well, Saida, I think, of course, it's a matter of trust, and I think this is more like a fieldwork question, as many of us know, that trust takes a very long time to build up. And people have to be convinced that you're not just helicoptering in and out and getting the information you want, that whatever you do with the information will get back to them and, help them in certain ways. But actually, the whole idea of working with communities became very strong in my mind, as with many people who work with archives for a long time, to say there's only so much we can do by preserving recordings. And what's the point of us keeping on doing that if we can't do anything about preserving the tradition where it lives, so that we need to work more, interactively, not with wanting to just record people, but that was when I felt that people need to record themselves or whatever we can do to strengthen those traditions so that they live in the community, because the real audience is always in the community. The more we take things out and decontextualize them, the less likely they are to survive, except for somebody finding a recording way later and being able to use it. I think there have been many projects, not so many maybe, but there have been some where people have been able to use archival materials to learn things again and so on. But there are fewer examples than we would like to see. But I don't know if that answers some of your question.
Yes, it does actually. It does. Thank you.
Susan Wadley has a nice question about a question about how do you deal with older materials, especially it's related specifically to some of the ARCE materials, some recordings, but I actually think it's a little bit of a broader question of what do you do with materials that you have from kind of a long time ago that maybe aren't either technologically still compliant or are having some issues, that sort of thing.
I'm not sure I understand that. Maybe I should look at Sue's question. We have collections hers for many years, and we keep working on digitizing them, Sue, and trying to keep them going. And we are slowly trying to start digitizing all the documentation, of which your collection is a great example of how much there is. And so whether it's very often, I feel the older the material is, there's going to be more demand from users, because very often people are interested in the older recordings. So what is the oldest thing that you have? So our Barker collection gets used a lot because of the 1930s, and it's so interesting. Balakrishnan is right here, who's recently accessed some older recordings just for that, for people to play them back in the field and say, this is what was sung all those years ago. So I feel in some ways the older collections get more valuable. But yes, it's technically it's a challenge for us to keep digitizing and keep, as I said earlier, keep moving them and to formats as we go along. And that's what, okay. Sorry, I'm just reading Sue's question about ethics. Yes, so that I think that's our own attitude, and everybody's attitude has changed a lot. We didn't earlier ask everyone to ensure that there was permission. Though we say performers' permission, we did not always encourage people to say, do you think the community would agree to this, or so on and so forth. So I think we've been changing in our own aspects. We started out, I always say, as a archive by scholars for scholars. And it's slowly changing. It still is largely used by scholars, and it's largely scholars who deposit. But I think our attitude has changed, and community performers have gained greater priority for us than they did. I think it's also something that happened in the humanities. We are talking much more in the last 20 years of bottom-up documentation of aspects like that has, I think, happened everywhere, of impact of colonization. I mean, all these issues have been coming up a lot in the last 20 years. So, Sue, I think, yes, we've been evolving as what we think about ethics also. And whether we always had permissions from community to make things accessible. So that always is a reservation about giving copies. We have to rely on the collector to say, do you think this is going to be okay? Because of you have the relationship with them to know that. We have to still rely on that. For example, when we published recordings on Smithsonian Folkways, which was a project called Global Sound, so that you knew about, we had to rely on the collectors to say, can you help us reach the performers to get permissions? Or would you think would be okay? So yeah, it's like many things, constantly evolving, changing minefield.
I mean, I know this is not directly relating to Sue's specific question about the oral records at ARC, but broadly, I was thinking about the then and the now, the 40-year question. And
Yes.
I think there is this tendency that I find, at least in many spaces, at least in India, that I've navigated, where there is a very strong push, I think even top down, for creating digital copies. And it's understandable from the perspective of access, but I think it also comes from a slightly myopic view that the here and now is there forever. And so there is this tendency that the last 30 years of the digital shall survive the next 100 years. And unfortunately, I am a little bit of maybe a skeptic about, I don't have a sense of how long the JPG file that you have just created using your flatbed scanner is going to live in the year 2077 or something, right? The so I think the thing that I suppose maybe broadly just to extract is, I mean, what I've learned from Shubha is, of course, that the migration of the data, that if there's a commitment to care, then you're caring enough to figure out how to constantly access it. And I think if we're able to sort of frame it around this question of saying, I need to constantly be able to catalog, preserve, and access it, then you will figure out what to do with each passing generation. The commitment has to be to that, not to create the digital copy and then erase the physical copy because it occupies too much space in the almirah. And unfortunately, this happens so often. So I'm just wondering, how do we bring the change in the way we think about what are you committing towards?
I think, Venkat, it's something I'm sure we've all discussed at Milli also, because we all struggle with resources. And I think I've heard at workshops of certain participants saying that a pressure from the higher ups in their organizations about why do they want to hang on to these things. We maintain this air-conditioned vault, and I'm constantly worried about someday somebody saying, why are you using up all these resources to keep these things which are already digitizing? And we know why we have to digitize, because we won't have the equipment to play those anymore. But we may, and we have to keep saying, because we may still find better ways of making digital copies or better access later on, and who knows what happens. But it's the many things that we have to institutionalize, no? Along with institutional trust and the care. And so that's what I felt, that the ethics of preservation doesn't get talked about enough. We're always talking about ethics of access, but that's part of the ethics of preservation. I think that as archives, we have to take this Hippocratic oath that we will preserve no matter what.
We're getting right down to the end. I want to make sure I give Mary just a minute to respond to any of this if you want to.
No,
No.
I agree. The ethics parts are really, and I think the preservation, a print and a book technology is a pretty stable one. All of the, although we've all seen crumbling paper and all these other sorts of things down through time, all of the other technologies need constant feeding. And I think that's part of our ethics question when we talk to people about, I think relating to Sue Wadley's question, which was sort of like, how do we negotiate the rights at the moment of time? We also need to think about how do we negotiate access through different media through time. And it's a challenging one.
Yeah. Yeah, this has been so wonderful. And I just want to give our AIIS president, Sumati Ramaswamy, a chance to say hello and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Emily. And of course, a fellow historian too, right? So, as a historian, it's an occupational hazard, as you know, for me to be in a permanent state of archive fever, to borrow a term from Derrida. So I so appreciated this wide-ranging conversation, and especially the fact that you paid attention to the scholarly, the political, the pragmatic, but really the ethical issues. I was so, as somebody who thinks about the archive all the time, I got new information and new citations and references. And I think, I speak for everybody who's gathered here, and a large number of them. when I say this was such a thoughtful and useful conversation, to have, and really appreciate the fact that you were able to join us all today. And a special thanks, of course, to Emily for, spearheading this initiative for us. Emily, I don't know whether you want to announce the next one or we're going to wait till the new year.
I think we need to wait to the new year because we're
Okay,
still
great.
negotiating with participants.
Okay, great. But for everybody who's gathered here, this is a new initiative where we are trying to, keep our community together in these very difficult times, building solidarity, camaraderie, but also just continuing to learn from real, wonderful experts like, the three folks we had here. So thank you all very much on behalf of AIIS for joining us. And I hope, wish you the best for the holiday season coming up. I hope it'll be a pleasant and restful one, and look forward to seeing you at the next iteration of the dialogue series. Thank you again, Mary, Shubha, and Venkat.
Yeah, thank you very, very much. This has been wonderful. Thank you.